We had 17 hours before the Vethkai fleet reached the Ardoon relay station. 17 hours to hold a position that 4 of our best tacticians had already calculated as indefensible. 17 hours before the station's population of roughly 9,000 engineers, analysts, 2 schools full of hatchlings, got processed into whatever the Vethkai considered a reasonable outcome for occupied infrastructure. The Conclave's response when we transmitted the distress signal? 12 cycles of committee review. 2 abstentions. 1 procedural delay filed by the Drachan delegate, who, I should note, had personal shipping contracts running through Vethkai-controlled space. So we did not get the Conclave fleet. We got 23 humans. I want to be precise about this, because the number matters, and because I have spent considerable time since these events trying to understand whether what I witnessed was exceptional or simply what humans consider a Tuesday. 23 of them. In a cargo hauler with a docking clamp that didn't fully retract and an engine signature that read, on our sensors, like a vessel experiencing slow structural failure, which, as Warrant Officer Vasquez later explained to me without any apparent concern, it was. They came in loud. They came in messy. 3 of them were already arguing before the airlock finished cycling. My commanding officer, Fleet Legate Orendu, looked at the manifest. Looked at me. His crest plates, which among my people signal about 40 different varieties of distress, pressed flat against his skull in a configuration I had never seen on a living officer. I had seen it once before in a training simulation, categorized under the subsection, Leadership Cascade Failure. These, he said, very carefully, are soldiers? I checked the manifest again. Technically, they were classified as a rapid interdiction and denial element. A ride unit. I did not know what that meant. I assumed it was a translation artifact. It was not a translation artifact. What followed over the next 51 hours of my life, which I am still not entirely sure I survived in any meaningful psychological sense, is recorded here, to the best of my ability, with only minor omissions for the sections where my observation logs appear to have malfunctioned, or where I simply stopped taking notes because I needed both hands free to hold onto something. The Vethkai fleet had 17 capital ships, 43 support craft, and a tactical AI that had never lost an engagement. The humans had Vasquez. I don't know how to explain what happened next except to say, I was there, and I still don't fully understand it, and I have been a military intelligence officer for 19 years. Begin the record. The first thing I noticed about Vasquez was her boots. This is not an observation I am proud of. I am a senior field analyst with the Conclave Intelligence Directorate. I have assessed orbital bombardment patterns, translated 4 non-standard dialects under active fire, and once correctly identified a Drachan double agent by analyzing their water consumption habits over a 9-day period. My observational skills are, by any reasonable metric, exceptional. And what I noticed about Vasquez within the first 4 seconds of her stepping through our airlock was that her boots were wrong. They were too heavy. Too thick at the sole. Built up on the interior in a way that our pressure suit interface would never accommodate, which meant she'd had them modified after the fact, or had them made custom, or, and this was the reading I kept returning to, had worn them so long that the boots themselves had restructured around the shape of her feet through sheer accumulated force of will. The rest of her came into focus afterward. Medium height for a human, which still put her above most of my crew at the shoulder. Dark hair pulled back against her skull in a style that I believe humans call functional rather than decorative. A jaw that had been broken at some point, I could see the faint misalignment in the mandibular line, and had apparently healed without correction, because humans do not always correct these things. A scar that ran from her left ear down toward the collar of her suit, pale and old and utterly without drama in the way she carried it, which is to say she did not carry it at all. It was simply there, like the worn knee plates of her armor were the 3 different patches sewn over an older tear in her left sleeve. She looked, in other words, like someone who had been in the field too long and didn't know it yet, because the field had become her default state. Behind her, 22 more. I need to describe the 22 more, because they matter and, because I have been asked, by 3 different debrief committees, whether they constituted a coherent military unit or whether I had, perhaps, misidentified a group of civilians. The answer is that by Conclave standards, I genuinely could not tell you. They had ranks. They had designations. They had equipment that ranged from standard issue to things I'm fairly certain they'd acquired through means that would not survive regulatory scrutiny. Two of them were having an argument about something called a heat pack before they even fully cleared the airlock. One of them, a large male with a shaved head and a rifle that appeared to have been painted with a decorative motif I later identified it as depicting a small earth reptile in a war helmet, was eating in an airlock during a station emergency with 47 minutes on the threat clock. His name was Corporal Ehejerica, and he would later, in a moment I am still cataloging under anomalous events that require additional framework to classify, be the reason approximately 600 people on this station did not die. But that comes later. At this moment he was simply a large human eating something that smelled, even through my suit filter, like burning chemicals, and he was doing it with a kind of focused serenity that seemed inappropriate for every element of our current situation. "You're the intel officer?" Vasquez said. "Not a question, really." She was looking at my rank insignia the way someone looks at a thing they've already assessed and filed. "Senior Analyst Freshkabai," I said. "Second Conclave Intelligence Directorate, Ardoon Station. I am your liaison for the duration of how many entry points to the station exterior?" I paused. 47 rated access points. 12 maintenance corridors with potential external breach risk. For which 3 would you use? Fleet-legged Orandu made a small sound behind me. I did not look at him. I was looking at Vasquez, who was looking at me with an expression that I have since spent a great deal of time trying to describe accurately, and which I can only characterize as, "I am going to need you to be useful, and I am running a preliminary assessment of whether that is possible." It was not hostile. It was, in its way, the most professional look I had received from anyone in years. I told her the 3 access points. She nodded once, turned to her unit and said something in a rapid lower register dialect that my translator flagged as English but failed to fully parse, something about stacking the odds and doing the thing with the thing from Kepler station, and then turned back to me and said, "We need your full sensor grid, your maintenance schematics, and whatever passes for coffee on this station." "We have filtered nutrient broth, is it hot?" "Yes." "That'll do." She said it with the tone of someone who had long ago made peace with suboptimal outcomes. I gave her the sensor grid. What followed for the next 4 hours was, and I want to be precise here, the most disorienting professional experience of my career, and I have had my career. The humans did not behave like a unit I recognized. They did not form up in the configurations our tactical manuals described. They did not hold formation briefings or review targeting matrices or run probability assessments on engagement outcomes. What they did was spread through my station like something that had no specific shape and, therefore, fit every available space in pairs and threes, poking at walls, testing hatch mechanisms, having conversations I couldn't fully overhear, occasionally laughing at things that, as near as I could tell, had nothing to do with our imminent tactical situation. Vasquez spent 40 minutes in my sensor room with 2 of her unit, a young woman called Nowak who moved like she expected every floor panel to be a trap, and a heavy-set older man named Brennan who appeared to be doing complex calculations in his head while simultaneously complaining about his lower back, and, when she came out she had a schematic drawn on the back of what appeared to be, I am not making this up, a food ration wrapper. She handed it to me. It was a complete defensive deployment map for the station. I mean complete. Entry vectors, withdrawal routes, fallback positions, overlapping fields of coverage for each of her 23 unit members, a notation system I didn't recognize but could parse structurally, and, in the upper left corner, a small hand-drawn notation that said this is the stupid part, adjust if Vethkai don't do what Vethkai always do, which I found equal parts alarming and, technically insightful. "What's the stupid part?" I asked. Section 7. I'm assuming they're breaching team stack left because every Vethkai engagement I've read stacks left. If they've adapted, Section 7 falls apart. She paused. You know if they've adapted? We have no current intelligence on Vethkai breaching team formations. So probably no. They usually don't. She said it without contempt. Just information, filed, accounted for. I looked at the schematic. This leaves the secondary reactor corridor entirely undefended. Yep. That is a critical infrastructure point. Also, yep. I waited for an explanation. She did not offer one. She was already looking at the next thing, which appeared to be a storage manifest, and she was doing that thing I was beginning to recognize as her version of intense concentration, which looked, from the outside, like someone only half paying attention. The reactor corridor, I said again. We need them to go there, she said. So we're making it look like a good option. You are intentionally presenting a vulnerability. I'm intentionally presenting the vulnerability. There's a difference. She looked at me then, and I noticed that her eyes had that quality I would later come to associate with humans who have spent a long time in situations where being wrong means being dead, a kind of deep, flat, very focused calm that sat underneath all her other expressions like bedrock. You ever play Drethkin? The board game? The board game, she confirmed. You lose Drethkin by playing the pieces you have. You win it by playing the pieces your opponent thinks you have. She went back to the manifest. Your reactor corridor is a piece I don't have. Fleet-legged Orindu found me in my office 2 hours before the Vethkai arrival window. He stood in my doorway with his crest plates in the configuration I was beginning to think of as permanent emergency. He had not, as far as I could tell, slept. Thresh Kavai, he said. Honest assessment. Sir. Can they hold this station? I had been a senior analyst for 11 years. I had a professional obligation to accuracy and a personal obligation to honesty, and both of them, in that moment, were pulling me in slightly different directions. I don't know, I said. I have insufficient framework to assess what they are doing. He stared at me. That is not an assessment. No, sir. It isn't. I paused. But I have been watching them work for 4 hours, and I have not yet seen them make a decision that turned out to be wrong for reasons I could identify. Their schematic is tactically sound. Their unit communication is unconventional but functional. And, Vasquez, I stopped. Vasquez, he said. She is performing some kind of calculation that I cannot fully read, I said. She keeps accounting for things before they exist. I asked her how she knew the Vethkai would approach on a specific vector, and she said she'd read their last 6 engagements and they always come from where they think they won't be seen, which is a predictive model I don't have documentation for, but which she appears to have derived from pattern analysis rather than intelligence data. Orindu was quiet for a moment. She said they always come from where they think they won't be seen. Yes. That's not a tactical doctrine. That's a characterization. Yes, I said. It is. He looked at the door. At the empty corridor beyond it. At something I couldn't identify. When I requested Allied support, he said, I specified a minimum force of 40 warships and a tactical AI rated for multi-vector engagement. I know, sir. We got 23 infantry and a cargo hauler with a structural fault. Yes, sir. And a woman who makes maps on food wrappers. I did not answer that. I wasn't sure what answer would be accurate. Orindu made a sound that might have been a laugh, if my people laughed in that register, which we do not. It was something adjacent to a laugh. Something in the same neighborhood. You know what my oldest son said to me before I took this posting? He said, Father, never be on the same side as humans in a war. It makes the other side unpredictable. What does that mean? I asked him the same thing, Orindu said. He said he wasn't sure yet. He'd heard it from his unit commander, who'd heard it from a human. He laughed. I stayed in my office for another 6 minutes, watching on the sensor grid as Vasquez moved through my station like she'd been born in its corridors, placing her people in positions that made no tactical sense to me individually but, which, when I mapped them against the schematic on the food wrapper, resolved into a pattern that I can only describe as, not defensive at all. Not a line to hold. Something else. Something that required the enemy to move first. The Vethkai fleet arrived in 11 hours. I did not sleep. I do not believe Vasquez slept either, but, for different reasons, she was in the maintenance corridor network for most of that period, and, when I next saw her, her boots had acquired new scuff marks on the right toe, and there was something dark on her left sleeve that I chose, as a professional courtesy, not to analyze. She had a cup of nutrient broth in one hand and the reactor corridor schematic in the other, and she was reading it with the same expression people on my homeworld use when they are checking, for the fourth time, that a door they know to be locked is, in fact, locked. Not doubt. The opposite of doubt. Something that had been tested so many times it had stopped being belief and become something closer to physics. 11 hours, I said. 10:42, she said, without looking up. Their transit pattern burned them about 18 minutes. Vethkai fleet commanders always push the drive when they think they have the element of surprise. A pause makes them a little predictable. I looked at her. At the schematic. At the boots. I found I had nothing useful to say. She did not appear to require anything useful from me. She turned back to the schematic, made a small notation in the upper margin, and walked back toward the reactor corridor. Corporal Ehejurika fell into step behind her, still eating. The Vethkai did not knock. I want to be clear about this, because I've read the official report submitted by Orendu to the conclave after the fact, which describes the Vethkai approach as an aggressive multi-vector incursion utilizing standard breaching doctrine. The official report is accurate in the way that describing a structural collapse as rapid unplanned disassembly is accurate. Technically correct. Emotionally insufficient. They hit us on 4 vectors simultaneously. Breach charges on the exterior hull at the maintenance junctions, the 12 I had flagged in my initial briefing, which they had apparently also identified as viable, because the Vethkai are competent and experienced and had every tactical reason to believe this station was staffed by conclave garrison infantry who would contest those corridors in the standard pattern. 3 corridors. Withdrawal to defensible interior. Buy time. Call for reinforcements that were not coming. The Vethkai had run this engagement 17 times against conclave installations in the past 8 years. Their casualty rate in those engagements averaged 4% of deployed force. Their success rate was 100%. This is the part where I should explain how what happened next was different. I was in the command center. That's where intel officers go during breaching engagements, into the seat with the most sensor access and the least direct fire exposure, which is where I can be most useful and, which, I will admit, also happens to be where you are least likely to be shot. I have made my peace with this arrangement. It is, by any measurable metric, the correct deployment of my skills. I had audio feeds from 8 of Vasquez's people. I had 12 sensor overlays. I had Orendu beside me, his crest plates now doing something I can only describe as architecturally wrong, pressed so flat they had begun to overlap in a configuration that I believe was biologically involuntary. And I had Vasquez's voice in my earpiece, very calm, saying, "They're stacking left at Junction 4. Told you. Brennan, you're on." What Brennan did at Junction 4 is something I have reviewed 17 times in the sensor record and still find difficult to fully describe. What the sensor record shows is this: a maintenance panel coming off the wall from the inside. Brennan's hands. A series of actions that lasted approximately 4 seconds. The panel going back on the wall. What the sensor record shows next is the Vethkai breaching team at Junction 4, 8 soldiers in hardened combat suits with weapons rated for piercing conclave hull armor, stopping. Not being stopped. Stopping. As if a variable in their internal calculation had changed, and the new output was weight. Because the pressure differential had shifted. It took me 40 seconds to understand what Brennan had done. He had rerouted the ventilation in that corridor to create a micropressure variance, not enough to hurt anyone, not enough to trigger any alert, just enough to make the atmospheric reading on the other side of that breach point look like the corridor had already been vented. Like someone had already opened something they shouldn't have. The Vethkai breaching doctrine, for corridors with anomalous atmospheric readings, required a secondary assessment before proceeding. 22 seconds by their standard timing. 22 seconds in which nothing happened that the Vethkai expected, and everything happened that Vasquez expected. I am going to try to describe the next 4 minutes of the engagement clearly, but I want to preface this by saying that my training does not fully equip me for this kind of account, because my training covers conventional engagements, and what Vasquez ran was not a conventional engagement. What Vasquez ran was, the closest word in my language is threvsot, which translates roughly as the use of an opponent's certainty against them. But, even that is insufficient, because threvsot is a tactical concept, and what I watched over those 4 minutes felt less like tactics and more like something else. Something I kept trying to name and couldn't. She didn't defend the corridors. She let them enter. The first Vethkai team through Junction 4 made it 30 meters into the interior before they stopped again. They stopped because of Nowak. I did not see Nowak. That is important. I had sensor coverage of that corridor, reasonable resolution, and I did not see Nowak until the moment she chose to be seen, which was not the same moment I thought I should be seeing her. She had been somewhere in the corridor for at least 6 minutes before the Vethkai team arrived. I went back through the sensor record, frame by frame, afterward, and I cannot tell you where. The sensor record shows an empty corridor. And then, it shows Nowak, and then, it shows the Vethkai team not moving. She wasn't pointing her weapon at them. She was standing at the far end of the corridor, back to them, looking at something on the wall. A panel. Like a maintenance check. And she didn't turn around. The Vethkai team held for 11 seconds. I watched their formation on the sensor. They shifted, fractionally, the way a unit shifts when their threat assessment is returning inconsistent data. The target was present. The target was not reacting. The target was not reacting in a way that suggested ignorance. It was, and I am using a word here that I did not think applied to tactical analysis, strange. The target was being strange in a way that made the standard response, engage, suppress, advance, feel like the wrong answer without providing a correct alternative. Vasquez's voice, in my ear, Nowak, you good? Nowak's voice, distant, genuinely conversational, doing the thing. Doing the thing, Vasquez confirmed, to no one in particular. I had no framework for the thing. 3 seconds later, 2 members of the Vethkai team moved to flank the standard response to a lone unresponsive target in a contested corridor. One left, one right, coming up along the walls. They made it 8 meters. The first one stepped into a section of deck plating that Brennan had, at some point in the previous 10 hours that I did not observe, carefully modified. Not a trap, exactly. An imbalance. A single floor panel that shifted under load by approximately 6 degrees, enough to send the Vethkai soldiers stride off rhythm, not enough to be detected as an intentional modification. The soldiers stumbled, fractionally, and that fraction broke their flanking timing, and their partner on the other side was already committed to a position that only worked in concert, and, for a period of approximately 1.4 seconds, both flanking soldiers were in exactly the wrong position. Nowak turned around. That is all the sensor record shows. Nowak, turning around. And then, 2 Vethkai soldiers on the deck, and Nowak standing between them, and the remainder of the Vethkai team at the far end of the corridor making the stillness before motion sound that, on the sensor audio, registers as near silence. 2 down, Nowak said, with the effect of someone completing a task from a list. Moving to 7. I want to pause here and tell you something that I told the debrief committee, which they noted and then appeared to set aside, because it did not fit the category they had allocated for my testimony. What Vasquez's unit was doing was not what I would call combat. It was not what my training identified as combat. Combat, in the frameworks I have been taught, is a contest of force applied intelligently, directed precisely, but fundamentally a measurement of what each side can bring to bear. The side with more force, better position, and better execution wins. The side with less adapts, withdraws, or is defeated. What Vasquez's unit was doing was something different. They were not bringing force to bear. They were bringing confusion. And it was working in a way that force could not have worked, because we did not have force. 23 infantry against a Vethkai fleet with over 400 boarding soldiers was not a force equation we could win. It was not a tactical scenario with a viable outcome under standard models. But, the standard models assumed the defending force would fight like a defending force. Would take positions, hold corridors, contest specific points of entry. Vasquez's unit was not a defending force. It was I kept returning to this and discarding it because it seemed like the wrong framework, and then, returning to it again, it was a station that had become difficult to be inside. Not dangerous in the way a fortified position is dangerous. Dangerous in the way a place is dangerous when you cannot read it. When the corridor that should be empty isn't, and the corridor that should be occupied reads wrong, and the floor does unexpected things, and you keep finding yourself positioned in ways you did not choose. The Vethkai boarding force, by the 14-minute mark, had made no meaningful territorial progress. They were still in the outer corridors. They were being very careful about the outer corridors. Orindu, beside me, had stopped making any sounds at all. His crest plates had moved from the emergency configuration into something I didn't have a classification for, partially raised on the left side, fully compressed on the right, with a slight forward pitch that in older behavioral documentation I'd once read was associated with witnessing something outside the range of prepared response. Thresh Kavai, he said, finally. Sir. What are they doing? I stopped. Tried again. They are making the station feel occupied by a larger and more competent force than is present. He looked at the sensor grid. There are 23 soldiers in my outer corridors. Yes. The Vethkai have 420 soldiers and 17 warships. Yes. They're being held by yes. He was quiet for a moment. Why aren't the Vethkai just flooding the corridors? Superior numbers force the engagement because they don't know how many we are, I said. And then I stopped because I had just understood something. They don't know how many we are because the thermal and audio signatures in this station currently read as I ran the sensor analysis myself. It took me 22 seconds. In the previous 4 hours, while I had been watching Vasquez and her unit and not, apparently, watching carefully enough, they had placed something I later determined it was a combination of thermal emitters pulled from station equipment, jury-rigged with power cells I have not fully inventoried in 17 different locations throughout the interstation. Not concealed. Just present. Putting out heat signatures that, at the resolution the Vethkai would be scanning from, read as bodies. As warm bodies occupying space. The station's ambient thermal profile had been, over the past 4 hours, quietly rearranged to suggest the presence of approximately 260 defenders. I sat with this information for a moment. She told me she was checking the maintenance schematics, I said. And? She was. She was also doing this. Vasquez's voice came through at the 19-minute mark, and there was something different in it that I could not immediately name, a particular flatness, a tightening at the edges, that I would later come to associate with the specific calculation that happens when you have been running controlled chaos and something has shifted outside the control. Thresh Kavai. They're pulling the lead teams back. I checked the sensors. She was right, the Vethkai advance elements were withdrawing toward the breach points. Not retreating. Reorganizing. Which meant they were consulting, which meant something had changed for them, which meant they're about to do something different, I said. Yeah. A pause. They figured out the thermal trick. Or they're about to. How long before they can recalibrate their scanners for closeband resolution? I ran the calculation. 7 minutes. Perhaps 10. How many soldiers do we actually read as at that resolution? 23. Right. Another pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. Okay. Different play. What does that mean? What it meant, I would learn, was that Vasquez had anticipated this specific contingency. Not because she had predicted it with certainty, she told me later, with characteristic understatement, I figured they'd figure it out, they're not stupid, but because she had built the first phase of the engagement specifically to use the time while the Vethkai were cautious. Time in which Brennan and Ehejurika and, for others, had been doing something in the secondary reactor corridor that had nothing to do with defense. The reactor corridor. The one she'd left empty on the schematic. The one she'd called the stupid part. The one she needed them to go to. What did you put in the reactor corridor? I asked. Her voice was already moving, I could hear the corridor sounds changing behind her, the acoustic signature of a different part of the station. Nothing, she said. Nothing. Nothing that looks like anything, she corrected. Yet. I looked at the sensor grid. At the 23 heat signatures now moving in patterns that no longer look like a defending force holding position, but something I had no tactical category for. The Vethkai would have their scanner recalibration in 7 minutes. They would discover 23 defenders. And whatever Vasquez was building in the reactor corridor was not yet complete. 7 minutes. I looked at Orindu. Orindu looked at me. Neither of us said anything, because there was nothing either of us could add to what was already in motion, and also because, and I will admit this openly, as a professional, in a recorded account that will be read by my superiors, neither of us had any idea what came next. Only Vasquez knew what came next. She had known since she drew the map on the food wrapper. The cooling system in the command center made a sound. A faint regular hum. I found myself listening to it very carefully, counting the intervals, because the intervals were consistent and measurable, and every other thing in my immediate professional reality had stopped being either of those things. 14 seconds between cycles. 14 seconds. I counted 6 cycles before the next thing happened. The Vethkai commander's name was Vareth 6 of the Thorn lineage, and she was, by every metric available to Conclave intelligence, very good at her job. I know this because I had read her file. I had read all their files, in the 3 hours between the arrival window and the boarding action, with the particular intensity of someone reading material that has immediate personal relevance to their continued existence. Vareth 6 had conducted 11 successful station seizures, 2 orbital asset captures, and 1 ground engagement on a contested moon that the Vethkai Tactical Academy apparently still used as a teaching case. She was patient, methodical, and had a documented habit of halting when conditions read as abnormal and recalibrating before proceeding. Which is exactly what she was doing now. The Vethkai pullback lasted 8 minutes, slightly longer than my 7-minute scanner recalibration estimate, which I mention not to be precise but because Vasquez had said 7 minutes, perhaps 10, and Vasquez had been right, and I was beginning to find her accuracy in these small predictions more unsettling than reassuring. The scanner recalibration happened. I could see the Vethkai signals change in the outer corridors as their closeband sweep activated the particular frequency signature of detailed thermal imaging, which my sensors could detect but not interrupt. They would now know there were 23 of us. Not 260. 23. Orindu said, "Here it comes." He meant the flood. The corridor saturation. The 400 soldiers no longer being cautious because caution had just been revealed as unnecessary against a force of 23. Vasquez's voice, Threshkavai. They just got the real count. Yes. What did Orindu say when that happened? I looked at Orindu. His crest plates. The specific configuration. He said, "Here it comes," I said. A pause. Fair enough. Tell him he's right. Another pause, shorter. And tell him it's fine. I relayed this. Orindu looked at the sensor grid and said nothing. The Vethkai did not flood the corridors. This is the part of the account that required the most explanation in the debrief, and the part that I still find most difficult to reconstruct accurately, because what actually happened does not fit comfortably inside the standard models for either Vethkai tactical doctrine or Conclave defensive protocols, and I have spent considerable time since working out whether it was brilliant or simply something so lateral that it had the same effect as brilliance. The conclusion I have reached is that these may be the same thing, and that I may need to update my frameworks. What Vasquez had built in the reactor corridor, working under the assumption that once the Vethkai got the real count, the reactor corridor would immediately become their most attractive option, because it was the most direct route to station control systems and it was the one gap in what it read as a defended perimeter, was not a weapons position. Not a barricade. Not a choke point in any configuration I would have designed. It was a problem. Specifically, it was the following problem: the secondary reactor corridor's main environmental system had been carefully, non-destructively modified over the previous 4 hours such that the atmospheric chemistry in that corridor now read, on a standard scanner, as containing trace amounts of a compound that did not belong in an inhabited station. The compound was real. Ehejerica had synthesized it from materials I am still reluctant to fully itemize, because the sourcing process apparently involved 3 things from the station kitchen, a component from a water recycling unit, and something from his personal kit that he described to me later as just a thing I carry, and it was genuinely present in the corridor air in small quantities. The compound was not dangerous. This is the part that required the most explanation. It was not dangerous to humans, or to most species in the Conclave roster. In trace atmospheric amounts, it was not dangerous to Vethkai either. The compound was, in fact, a relatively benign industrial byproduct with a distinctive scanner signature. The distinctive scanner signature of early-stage containment failure in a specific model of Vethkai reactor coupling. The model used in Vethkai military vessels manufactured in the last 32 years. Not in Conclave stations. Not in any station. In Vethkai military hardware specifically. The scanner signature that, in Vethkai safety protocol, required immediate verification before any personnel entered the affected area, because early-stage containment failure in that specific coupling model, if not addressed within a defined window, progressed to a type of cascade that the Vethkai had spent considerable engineering effort trying to prevent after losing 2 ships to it during the early expansion period. It was the one alarm that Vethkai military doctrine required to halt for. The one thing they wouldn't rush through. You knew their safety protocols, I said, when Vasquez told me this later. I knew their ships, she said. You learn their ships, you learn what makes them stop. How did you know what compound to synthesize? She gave me a look that I have come to associate with humans who are deciding whether to explain something or simply let it stand. Ihedjarika served 2 tours on a Vethkai-adjacent border station, she said. He's been in more Vethkai engine rooms than most Vethkai mechanics. He knows what that signature smells like. I processed this. He synthesized a Vethkai reactor alarm from station kitchen materials. And a water recycler part, she added. He said the water recycler part was important. The Vethkai halt at the reactor corridor lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of 400 soldiers not moving, while Vareth 6 presumably ran a verification protocol on a cascade alarm that was never going to resolve because it wasn't coming from the source the protocol expected. 11 minutes that Vasquez used. I watched the sensor grid. I watched 23 heat signatures move through my station with a purposefulness that had changed, not more urgent, exactly, but differently directed. Like something that had been coiled and was now extending. They weren't defending anymore. Or rather, they had never been defending. They had been I kept reaching for the word and, finding only approximations, repositioning. In the same way that a thing you believe to be stationary turns out, when you look away and, back, to have moved into a completely different place than where you remembered it. The sensor grid showed the Vethkai outer corridor teams. It showed their formation, still good, still professional, still exactly what Vareth 6 would have deployed. It did not show what was behind them. Because Vasquez's unit had spent the last 11 minutes getting behind them. Not all of them. That would have been impossible, and Vasquez did not attempt the impossible when she could attempt the difficult, which is a distinction that sounds minor and is not. 12 of her 23. Nowak was 1. Ihedjarika finally, done eating, which I found disproportionately reassuring, was another. They had used the maintenance corridors, the subfloor access points, 3 ceiling panels that had apparently been accessible from the inside in a way I had not known about until I watched them use it on the sensor record. They were behind the Vethkai outer corridor teams. Between those teams and the breach points. Between those teams and their ships. When the Vethkai finally cleared the reactor corridor alarm as a false positive, which Vareth 6 would have had to log as an anomalous sensor event, which would have required explanation, which would have been a problem for her post-engagement report, they reorganized and pushed for the interior in earnest. They pushed for approximately 40 seconds. And then, they stopped again. Because the breach points were not blocked. Not destroyed. The word I am looking for is occupied, but that isn't quite right either. The word Vasquez used, when she reported in, was compromised. Breach points are compromised, she said. They can go back through them. They'll just have problems. What kind of problems? Orindu said. He'd taken over the comm directly at some point in the past few minutes without either of us remarking on it. Structural problems, she said. the kind that slow you down. And make a lot of noise. And, she added, with a pause that I recognized as the human conversational equivalent of underlining, happen to register on shipside sensors as the kind of breach activity that looks like someone else is coming through. I want to try to describe what happened to Vareth 6 in those next 20 minutes, and I want to try to do it fairly, because Vareth 6 was, as I said, very good at her job, and what happened to her was not a failure of skill. She was in a station with 400 soldiers. She was facing 23 defenders. She had the real count. She knew 23. She was also receiving signals from her breach points that read as an unauthorized approach from an external force, specifically, the acoustic and structural profile that Vethkai ship sensors categorized as combat-class vessel contact with station hull, which was, in context, the signal that meant reinforcements. Enemy reinforcements. She didn't know it wasn't real. Because Vasquez's people had, in 22 seconds of work at 3 separate breach points, created the exact mechanical and acoustic signature of that specific sensor event using the material at hand, which included hull stress emitters pulled from the thermal profile rigs they'd already built, 2 impact charges set for specific vibration patterns rather than destructive yield, and, I note this because it remains the most difficult part of the account to explain to the debrief committee, a length of heavy cable that a Hedgerika had been carrying in his pack since they boarded and, which he described, when asked, as just useful. The vibration signature of combat-class hull contact registered on 3 Vethkai ship sensors simultaneously. Vareth 6 received the alert. She had 400 soldiers inside a station she now believed was about to have enemy reinforcements arriving from outside. She had an unresolved reactor anomaly on her log. She had outer corridor teams that were, at that moment, in contact, not heavy contact, not the kind that generates casualties at scale, but persistent, exhausting, strange contact with defenders who didn't behave like defenders, and she had, somewhere in her professional assessment, a data point that I think she must have been sitting with for a while. 23 defenders. 23. Who had spent 40+ minutes making her force of 400 move slowly. Carefully. Wrong. Who had put a Vethkai reactor alarm in a station that contained no Vethkai reactors. Who were behind her outer teams. Who were now, apparently, calling for support that she couldn't account for. What does a competent, experienced commander do when the tactical picture has been producing consistent anomalies, when the defender count is implausibly low against the resistance encountered, when the scenario keeps generating data that doesn't fit the model? She questions the model. Vasquez told me later, over the last of the nutrient broth, which was by that point genuinely terrible, cold in the way that hot things become cold when no one has had time to care about them, that this was the only part of the plan she hadn't been certain about. You can create confusion, she said. You can manufacture signals. You can make a space feel wrong. She was looking at her cup. But, whether a specific commander makes the specific choice when you need them to, that's not mechanics. That's a read. And, you read Vareth 6 correctly. I read her file. She's lost 2 forces to ambushes where she stayed in the engagement too long. She paused. Smart people get careful when they recognize a pattern. Even when the pattern isn't there. You manufactured a pattern she'd seen before. I showed her the shape of a mistake she'd already made twice. She set down the cup. She's too good to make it a third time. Vareth 6 ordered a withdrawal. Not a rout. A professional, structured withdrawal, with covering formations and correct staging, executed exactly as her training specified. She pulled her teams back through the outer corridors with no significant additional casualties, moved them through the breach points, carefully, slowly, because the points were compromised and, moving through them was exactly as difficult and loud as Vasquez had made it, and departed with her fleet intact. The Ardoon relay station was still ours. Orandu did not say anything for a long time after the sensor grid showed the Vethkai fleet breaking orbit. Neither did I. After a while, he said, 23. Yes. She knew, he said. He wasn't asking. When she got here. She already knew how this ended. I think she knew how she wanted it to end, I said. There's a difference. He thought about this. Is there? I thought about the food wrapper schematic. The reactor corridor marked the stupid part. The thermal emitters placed not to deceive but to buy time, which was never the same as deceiving but produced identical results if you were precise about the window you needed. The Vethkai reactor signature that a HFY had been carrying the components for carrying, just in case, the way humans apparently carry things just in case. I'm not sure, I admitted. Vasquez was in the outer corridor. I could see her on the sensor grid. She was doing a walkthrough, checking her people, stopping at each one, saying something I didn't have audio for but, which registered, from the length of each stop and the body language my sensors could read, as, "You okay? Good. You okay? Good." Not a debrief. Not an after-action assessment. Something else. Something that had no tactical category and, therefore kept falling out of my reporting frameworks and, having to be manually reinserting as unit welfare check, which is technically accurate and, completely wrong. Corporal Ehejerica, passing her in the corridor, said something. She laughed. I don't know what he said. My audio pickup was insufficient. But, I have thought about it since, that particular laugh, in that particular corridor, with the Vethkai fleet still visible as departing signatures on the outer sensor grid and 23 people checking in on each other in a station that should not, by any reasonable calculation, still be inhabited by its original occupants. Orindu went to make his report to the conclave. I stayed in the command center for a while longer. I ran the sensor log back to the beginning. I watched Vasquez come through the airlock again, the wrong boots, the old scar, the schematic not yet drawn because the food wrapper wasn't empty yet. I watched the way she moved through the station those first hours, touching walls, reading panels, not building a defense but building a map of the space that wasn't about physical position but about how the space would feel to someone moving through it under pressure, what it would suggest, what it would imply, what it would make a careful commander worry about. She had never been trying to hold the station. She had been trying to hold the idea of the station, the version of it that existed in Verith 6's threat assessment, where the numbers were wrong and the patterns were familiar and the rational, professional response was to stop. I filed my incident report. I used the phrase unconventional defensive doctrine in the section header, because I needed a section header and that was the most accurate phrase available to me. I added a supplementary note at the end, flagged for the attention of the Conclave Advisory Board, which read, recommend immediate review of Allied Force request protocols. Specifically, when human units are available and conventional Allied support is not, the calculus for acceptable engagement odds may require significant revision. The Conclave Advisory Board, as far as I know, is still reviewing it. I keep checking. They are very careful, the Advisory Board. Very methodical. They like to understand a situation fully before responding. The humans, I imagine, find this familiar.